My book is about the future, and it's like a futurist book, like Future Shock or one of these other books, except I think a little bit more personally, I think a little bit more down to earth and connected in what important things are happening. Most futurist books are, they like to tell extravagant stories about cloning or spaceships or things like that. But I'm really just talking about something important, namely risk management and incentives. What the book predicts is a democratization of finance. And by that I mean finance and insurance will be much more important parts of our everyday lives. They'll filter through the general population much more than they have in the past. And see, there's a recognition among people who do business that progress requires risk-taking, that the future is always vague and hard to see, that there's some entrepreneurial activity is the driver of economic growth, and it is essentially something to do with uncertainty. Moreover, they see the importance of proper incentivization, that you have to design financial contracts so that people are incentivized to really pursue good work. So I give the example of venture capitalists who are in the business of helping new businesses get started. And the real world is a very risky one. In the United States, 50% of new businesses fail within 5 years. So if you were doing it by mortgaging your house and investing your own money, it'd be almost impossible to start a new business. And the risks would be prohibitive. It's also something that takes maybe the best years of your life. It has a chance of failing, which is greater than 50%. It's pretty unattractive. But we have financial institutions that create incentive packages that pay the person a salary, guarantee that you won't be out on the street after the business fails, so people can pursue their genius. Okay, so the first thing is about the magnitude of economic risks. Well, the first thing to recognize is economic risks have always been with us. First of all, for nations, sometimes nations grow dramatically and sometimes they don't. And people can't figure it out often, even after the fact. I did a book tour in Mexico for the Spanish translation in August, and we were talking about Mexico. And someone said, you know, Mexico really hasn't grown per capita since 1982. And nobody knows why. We went through all the list of reasons, and it's remarkable since they've been sending so many Mexicans to America. We're a safety valve for them, for their economy. And even in spite of that safety valve, they're not growing. Well, nobody, and neither is Germany, incidentally. It's falling behind. There are a lot of, in Argentina, there's lots of examples. This is an example of uncertainty, and nobody knows what's happening next. Believe me, economists have all their stories and theories. We don't know the future of countries, and neither do we know the future of individuals. And this is something that people don't like to hear, but I believe that chance plays a big role in our lives, in our economic success. People don't like to hear it because you develop an ego involvement with your own success, and you don't want to hear that it could have turned out otherwise or that some other events you tend to think it's because I'm a smart person that I've succeeded. Well, of course that's part of the reason, but there's the other element of pure chance, and that's what we want to reduce. That's what finance does. It reduces the chance element. Now, one reason why I believe that risks are even bigger than historically for individuals and for nations is the rapid expanse of information technology. I quote in my book Norbert Wiener in his 1948 book Cybernetics, which is a classic. It was a book that laid out the future for computers right at the beginning of the computer revolution. And there's a remarkable passage in that book, which was written right after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs had been dropped. And he said, remarkable for this advocate of computers, he said, I don't know which is more dangerous, the atom bomb or the computer. He didn't call it computer, the ultra high-speed computing machine, because he said that it changes the economics so fast, and it can make people obsolete. It hasn't happened yet. Well, maybe it has happened, but only on a small scale. But I think information technology is stirring things up in such dramatic ways that, in a sense, it wasn't, the computers weren't important in 1948, and they became gradually more important. There's an exponential growth path. Now they're becoming fabulously more important. And so it might be now that Norbert Wiener's fears may come true. One thing that information technology does is it creates a winner-take-all effect. When the movie was invented in the 19th century, well, it took a while, but eventually it created superstar actors and actresses who made millions of dollars. Why? Because they could sell their acting to millions of people. When they invented television, it created superstar athletes who made millions of dollars, or even tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Why? Make no mistake, it's the technology that did that. If we were stuck in 19th century technology, which would have been stadiums to see the athletes, they could not possibly obtain that salary. Now, the theme of my book is that new information technology risks the same effect spreading vastly to many, many other occupations. That there can be a winner-take-all effect as the talented, the best people can suddenly expand their ability to sell their services much more widely. So I think that there's a risk of a substantial increase in inequality. You'll have a few you won't have one Bill Gates, you'll have 1,000 Bill Gates. And you'll have lots of people who are pretty smart that somehow it didn't work out for them. They weren't quite at that top. They weren't the top 10 tennis players, maybe the top 10,000 tennis players, and that does them nothing. And also, globalization is enhanced by information technology, and the world is a terribly unequal place. You can hire a computer programmer in India for 1/10 of what it costs in the United States. And as teleconferencing and as email and all these things expand, the barriers toward that person competing with the US computer programmer are just falling away. So I think that there's a lot of risks. But reasons for optimism, the reasons for optimism are that the same information, first of all, the same information technology that drove these problems. And so I'd like to give the example of what eBay has done, or other auction sites have done for auctions. Auctions used to be, if you go back 10 or more years ago, if you want to, I'm talking about a serious international auction, that was reserved for wealthy people who had expensive works of art, and they'd go to Christie's or Sotheby's and they'd have this big auction. But it's been transformed forever. And now we've had a democratization of the international auction, and people are selling items from their attic all over the world. Another reason for optimism is that financial theory has developed, and this is an ongoing thing over the last 10, 20, or 30 years, where mathematical finance has developed into a field as rich as theoretical physics, and it allows a much better idea of diversification and how it's done and how hedging and risk spreading can happen. It suggests a vision, which I talk about in the book, of the limit of risk management, where risks are spread all over the world. But we aren't anywhere near that now. We only spread certain kinds of risks around the world. Most risks are still borne individually by individual countries or individual people. And another thing that financial theory has developed is the theory of moral hazard, which is how efforts to protect people from risks create bad incentives, and you have people doing bad things like phony accounting or doing investments for show rather than for reality. These are problems that we're getting a better understanding. And then finally, behavioral finance is the theory of psychology applied to finance, and I think it's very important. The Nobel Prize won a year earlier was won by a psychologist, Danny Kahneman at Princeton, who helped. One thing that Kahneman did is teach us the importance of framing, psychological framing, that the way people behave is inconsistent. It depends on context and situation. But we learn from this research, there's a lot of psychological research, and we learn better how to design institutions that take account of that. There's also a recent psychological literature on what's called as the risk as feelings hypothesis, which I can't get into much here, but the point is that people's ability to manage risks is mediated, like anything else, by their emotions. Emotions are part of the brain and how it functions. And the brain is well constructed to deal with immediate and present risks. So if a wild animal came running into this room, we would all react immediately, and our adrenaline would start flowing and our heart rate would go up. And we would take action. You can believe it. There's no wild animal coming, right? I'm saying you can believe it. But if I tell you that you're not saving enough for your retirement, it doesn't generate the same feelings. It probably puts you to sleep. And that's a problem, that the human mind has trouble handling risks. It postpones thinking about them forever. But if we understand this, we can deal with it. And I think the history of finance is really a history of overcoming psychological barriers to risk management. Now, as for the private sector, I believe that we have to, in making progress, exploit existing institutions which have developed expertise in handling real risk issues, and expertise that cannot be, that has to be relied upon. So the first is for the insurance industry, the second is for the security industry, and the third is for the lending or banking industry. So for the insurance industry, the first idea, I think that we can and should extend the concept of insurance to cover livelihoods. And in particular, we already have forms of livelihood insurance. Disability insurance will protect you. If you become paralyzed, you will get an income for life. It protects your income. But it protects only a narrow class of threats to your income. It was designed long ago because of the information technology of the day, which could not guarantee your economic value without generating a moral hazard. But we have better ways of doing it now, and so we could settle livelihood insurance on occupational indexes, narrowly defined, rather than on your own income to deal with moral hazard. So the idea is you'd get on a website and you would look over the different careers that you might be going into and look for the insurance rates that you'd pay to protect you. The policy would give you money if the career fails. And this would, I'm trying to speed through this. This would essentially be offering to every individual the kind of things that venture capitalists design today for new entrepreneurs. But I want to see this entrepreneurship to go down to the people and not just be for businesses. We can do this because new information technology allows us to supply services that were once costly, that required lawyers, that specialized your contract. We can make these generic and offer them to everybody. And it can be very important, a very important stimulus to economic growth that we've never experienced before if individuals are protected from career risks. Right now, nobody, almost nobody, would take a career path that has a greater than 50% chance of failing within 5 years. You don't do that because nobody protects you. And failing is, it's a very unpleasant experience. But we can, if we create contracts that protect people from failure individually, they will take more risks. The second idea, and this is for the securities markets, is macro markets. I actually wrote a book in 1993 about this, and it didn't happen fast, but the stock market is a market for claims on corporate incomes. But corporate incomes are a small fraction of national income. So why don't we have markets which are analogous to the stock market on claims on other components of income? You can break it down in many different ways, like occupational income or categories of income, or you can do the whole country. So there should be a market for every country of the world, a market for the United States. It would be a security that pays a dividend proportional to the GDP of the United States. Now I'm actually working on that. I've set up another firm called Macro Securities Research with my former student, Alan Weiss. And we're working with the American Stock Exchange. It's not happening, it's happening in some sense. We've gone through all the legal work to create, and we have a patent on a security called the macro security. But it turns out that they don't want to trade GDP right away. It's more mundane than that. But we're getting, I think we'll within a year have a new, it's like a new ETF that will be trading on the Amex. And I hope it will eventually be extended to things like GDP risk or city risk. We want to have a security that you can short, which you should probably be doing here in San Diego, because the market is getting risky to protect your home value, but it'll be a while before that comes. But maybe you will be able to do this before the crash even comes in San Diego. There will likely be a crash in San Diego, but it will recover. So for long-term investors, it's not as big a thing as I'm making it out. But the third idea is for the lending industry, and that is that loans should be indexed to income. The example is Bulgaria in 1994 got a loan through Citibank that was tied to their GDP. It's a wonderful thing for a less developed or medium developed country like Bulgaria to do, because it protects them against their own economy failing. And it was a good thing that Bulgaria did this, because they're another example of a country with disappointing economic performance in the last decade. Argentina is talking about doing this now. The idea was originally expressed by Milton Friedman in his 1962 book, Capitalism and Freedom, that people should be allowed to sell shares in their own future income. Just like corporations do that. Corporations sell shares, they get the money, and they invest in new factories. People should be able to sell shares in their future income. They get the money, and they invest in an education, or human capital as it's called. Why isn't there an analogy? But Milton Friedman doubted that it could happen in the book, because he said, first of all, there will be irrational public condemnation of such a market solution. It sounds like slavery. And secondly, he said that he didn't think that it would be too costly to enforce. People move around, you can't even find them, you've got to sue them to make them pay. Running over many years, he just thought it was infeasible. However, his reasons for doubt have changed. First of all, the public is more receptive toward market solutions, and I don't think we have the irrational public condemnation that he described. Moreover, information technology, for good or ill, has made it really easy to track people and find them, and the world has changed. So, remarkably, Milton Friedman's idea, which was emphasized, which he himself thought unworkable, has actually been implemented, and the biggest example is in Australia. There's the so-called HECS student loan program. It's called Higher Education Contribution Scheme, which was created about 10 years ago and is now the dominant form of student loans in Australia. And what it is, students borrow for their college education. They pay back later as a percent of their well, not exactly, but it's essentially as a percent of their subsequent income. So the more successful ones pay back more. The failures pay back less. That's risk management. It encourages risk-taking, and they can do it in Australia because they've got this sophisticated electronic tax system. They got the tax authority collecting. You can't escape it except by emigrating. They haven't got it perfect. You can still leave Australia and not do it. Okay, the fourth idea is inequality. And this I'll have to go through. I'm really out of time. I didn't plan my time as well as I hoped. Inequality insurance is an idea that I had to address the risk that inequality is going to get much bigger in the future. So I'm proposing that we index the tax system to the extent of inequality in such a way that it automatically becomes more progressive if inequality gets worse from where it is now. I'm not proposing doing anything to alleviate the inequality we have today. Let's just stop it from getting worse. Inequality is not a bad thing within limits because it creates a sense of incentives and possibility. But we just don't want it to get crazily bad, because I think that will be a bad outcome. The fifth idea I called intergenerational social security. And this is more subtle, but it's basically recognizing that social security is not only for the old, it's really risk sharing among the generations. We have to understand how it functions as a risk management device, and we can do that by understanding that there's 3 generations alive at any given day. There's the children, there's the working adults, and there's the retired elderly. And they all have their different needs and economic circumstances. The system should be risk-sharing among the 3 groups. And yet that concept has not been really even mentioned in most discussions of reforms of Social Security. And the 6th idea is for international agreements for risk control. And this is the idea that international leaders ought to think more like business people and international agreements should be risk management. Now, we now have the first MBA president in George Bush, but he hasn't done this yet. Maybe because his counterparts are not thinking this way. But when George Bush meets with any other national leader, they should arrange a swap between the countries, a risk managing swap, which effectively says, if our country does better than yours, we pay you. If your country does better than ours, you pay us. It's what companies do all the time. Governments should start doing this. So I guess I'm out of time. I was going to say, I'll just say briefly, my last thing about reasons for optimism in the historic past. Radical financial innovation has occurred at various times in history. And the reason that they were successful was that the kind of factors that I've talked about before that allowed people to make innovations, allowed inventors to come up with a new device that handled risks and the psychological barriers, that used the information technology in a new way, and the inventions were copied around the world. So let me just give you quickly the two examples that I was going to do. One is life insurance. Life insurance, it has ancient antecedents. In ancient Rome, there were things that people point to that look a little bit like insurance, but they didn't have the concept. And it was because they didn't understand the concept of insurance. It never developed into much. In the 1600s, they invented probability theory. And in the 1600s, they got the idea of constructing life tables, which give the probability of death by age. So actuarial science was invented. This created a whole new industry that saw ways of managing risks. And so that was a very important breakthrough. Analogously, I think the advances in financial theory that we have now can do the same now. But insurance didn't take off right away. It was initially, in the 1600s and 1700s, a rarity. And it was only some intellectuals and some wealthy people who did it. It was not common. It had to overcome barriers, such as the risk as feelings hypothesis. Most people were not attuned to buying life insurance. Even though when the life expectancy was 45 years, life insurance was very, very important. Of course, it was also expensive, because if people are dying so young. What the problem life insurance solved was that a husband would die, the woman has 3 children, and she doesn't have any source of income. It was terrible when that happened. But even so, they couldn't sell it. Viviana Zelizer wrote a book about the failure to sell life insurance in the 19th century. And she made a number of observations. She said that, remarkably, even though women were the prime beneficiaries of life insurance, they were the ones who resisted it the most. And why didn't women want life insurance? Well, she found some quotes from women of the end. Basically, a life insurance salesman would try to present the concept of life insurance to a typical 19th century woman, and she would say, in response, "It doesn't sound right to me. This sounds like some crazy scheme where I'm going to bet that my husband is going to die and I'm going to win if he dies." And she would say, "It just doesn't sound right. This sounds like you're challenging God. Maybe God's wrath will come down upon me for having made this bet that my husband will die." And they couldn't make the sale. So what they did is they revised the marketing and the description of insurance, and they decided to dispense with explaining the probability theory, which she will not grasp, and not having gone to school and not having understood these things. So instead, the life insurance salesman, later in the 19th century, came across as a sort of missionary. And the salesman would say instead to the woman, he would say, "You know, if you buy life insurance, it will give a sort of immortality to your husband, because he can love and protect you from beyond the grave." And so it's a little, that sounds silly, but that is in fact what happened. And they changed the framing, and they made it, and it became also recommended by authorities, and they connected it to institutions, benevolent institutions, and eventually everybody got it. But now life insurance is an anachronism. I mean, it's still good. It is so cheap. You see those ads on TV where they say for $15 a month you can have 100,000, whatever it is. It is so cheap because people don't die young anymore, almost never. But there are other kinds of risks that we have to adapt our insurance to. And the risks I'm talking about is this terrible economic turmoil that the world is going to see in the next decades, which will affect our livelihoods. And we should really be worrying about those risks going forward. The second example that I give is the invention of Social Security in Germany in the 1880s. They were the first country to invent health insurance, workers' compensation, and Social Security, old age insurance. And what's little known was that the United States Social Security system today is a virtual carbon copy of the 19th century German system. We just copied it and we haven't changed. It's amazing to me. The German invention was, people saw it and they thought it worked because there were no beggars. The elderly people seemed to be living good. Everything worked better in Germany, so it was copied all over the world. The United States was the last country to adopt it in 1934. But even here, it finally got copied, and no one's ever going to go back. This was an important invention. And I just wanted to, in thinking about, I was reading about the discussions that led to the invention of Social Security in Germany in the 1880s. And one thing that struck me, and this will be my last point, that struck me about the German innovation was that it had something to do with improved information technology of the late 19th century. The 19th century was a spectacular century for information technology, although we tend to forget that now. It was more mundane things. Although they did invent computers of sort in the 19th century, but they weren't functioning well yet. But the thing that they did that was effective was they first invented cheap paper. In 1800, at the beginning of the century, all paper was made by hand from cloth. It was very expensive. They invented the paper machine, and they invented wood pulp paper, and paper became available. You didn't ever get receipts. There were very few forms. There was no paper around because it was too expensive. Then they invented carbon paper, 19th century. They invented printed forms. They invented the typewriter, which speeds data transmission, and it allows carbon copies, 5 or 6 carbon copies, which means that you can keep backup copies. They invented filing cabinets. They invented the postal service. Though there was mail in the 18th century, it was very slow, and it cost like Federal Express to mail a letter, and almost nobody got any mail. They invented street addresses. That was a were there those numbers on your houses? That was a 19th century invention. The reason this, and they invented civil service. They got good functioning management teams in the government. And up until then, they'd always been corrupt and ineffective. Germany led the world in civil service, and it had an effective government institution. So when they proposed this idea of government old age insurance for everybody in Germany, other countries looked on it and thought it's unworkable. This is a grand social experiment. No country has ever, there's 11 million working people in Germany at that time. The government is going to keep track of all these people, and it's going to, over decades, it's going to keep records, and then it's going to pay them back, it's going to send them checks. I mean, this is just crazy, they thought. But Germany made it work, and it then was seen to work, and it now is everywhere. It's the same kind of innovation that I think we can do now. Our information technology has made so many advances since the 1880s, and we have to explore and think about how this information technology can really lead to radical financial innovation. So I will stop and see you